Most people in Malaysia don't know this. We have a very novel production sharing contract regime in Malaysia. Let's say Shell has found oil and gas in the ground under its contracted production sharing contract for 20 years. When it operates the field and makes a profit out from it, Shell only gets 5% of the profit it had made. Another 5% goes to the state of Sarawak. The remaining 90%, for all the work that Shell had put in, 90% of that goes to PETRONAS on behalf of the federal government. So already you can see today,
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. We have had a few requests for us to talk about this, and I think you're in a unique position as well to tell us what's happening, but also to add some analysis, given your position as both a Sarawakian, as well as someone who has worked in Shell, held executive positions, not just in Shell Malaysia, but across its different offices as well. The topic is the PETRONAS-PETROS dispute. Dad, do you want to maybe start by telling us what exactly is going on?
well, it all starts with the Petroleum Development Act. In 1974, Malaysia introduced a law called the Petroleum Development Act. That law says all oil and gas that is found in Malaysia belongs to the federal government. And by that law, federal government gave the proxy to PETRONAS to carry out the activities on behalf of the federal government. That's what it does. So everything that is found, so that means, Leon, if you have a piece of land, if the oil and gas is found just under your own land, it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to federal government. So that's the starting point. Now, at that point, much later years, Sarawak then argued there remained a law, it's called the Sarawak Mining Ordinance, that was already there long before the formation of Malaysia. And the argument that they've said at that time was, by virtue of that law, the oil and gas that's found in the territories of Sarawak belong to Sarawak. So that was the starting point when all of this began. And so then it became political. The conversation around that then went into a very different discussion. And the discussion is, okay, let's find a compromise where actually we don't take all of that. Sarawak says we are not taking all of it because although the law, the Sarawak Mining Ordinance says so, but we accept that we only take 20% of it rather than 100%. So then the argument that arose was, because we're part of the federation, we only take 20% of it. The remaining 80% belongs to federal government. That's the starting point. Then everybody said, okay, if that was the case, then the question that arose as a result of that discussion where the coexistence that Sarawak and Sabah remain part of the federation, they don't claim the 100%, they claim only 20%, then it became a question of royalty. So that then moved into a royalty discussion. So all of that was a long discussion during Barisan Nasional's time when they were there. The discussion about royalty was there. Pakatan then made lots of promises when they are opposition that they will pay the 20% royalty. So when Pakatan won and they were in government, then it became a story that changed from 20% of revenue to 20% on net profit. Then the argument was shifted because both Sabah and Sarawak argued all along they've been talking about 20% of revenue rather than 20% of profit. And this was a huge then quarrel between them. So that all of that became the main discussion point. This is where the argument from federal government was put there. Two things. Federal government says if you take 20% of revenue, there comes a time when PETRONAS could actually die as a corporation. So the argument is if you did that, it will then kill the golden goose that lay the golden egg. You must remember that PETRONAS contribute 40% of government revenue. 40% is a lot. So that's the argument was, if you take 20% of revenue rather than 20% of profit, it could lead to the eventual demise of Petronas. That's a fair argument that people put there. That's one.
For Petronas, but also negatively affecting the national coffers as well.
Which is the second point, spot on, Leo. So that's first point. The second point, exactly your point. If you did this, it will take away significant component out from the government federal coffer, and therefore it cannot then provide all what is needed for the rest of the federation. Because if both Sabah and Sarawak claim that money, then federal government has got a problem meeting its obligations. These are the two challenges that they had there. So let me put that aside. So that's a question of royalty.
Yep.
Lately, in subsequent years, the last few years, another issue had emerged. This is the issue about the gas aggregator. The gas aggregator came about because, I worked in Shell for 23 years, Leon. I left Shell in the year 2005. I remember December 2005, I left Shell when I went to Malaysia Airlines. At that time, when I was in Shell, I was on the board of MLNG. I was the managing director of Shell MDS. Now, what was clear at that time, up to that time, there was no role played by Petronas, which was called the aggregator. There was no such role.
Explain what the aggregator is for those who don't know.
In layman terms, it's a trader. It's an internal trader. So let me illustrate the point. In the past, the way it worked is you have MLNG as a customer. They buy gas from the gas field. And then Shell MDS also buy gas from the gas field. Let's take these two as an example. Both of them have 20-year contracts with the gas provider, the upstream side of it. So the volume is contracted for 20 years. The price is contracted for 20 years. And that they will provide this annually based on a particular schedule. And the same thing for MLNG. Now, all this while, they were operating separately. We call them production sharing contract provider and then the buyer. So that they were actually, if you like, two trains running parallel. Now, much later, I think long after I had left, because that role never existed, Petronas then decided, why don't we create an aggregator role that pulls this together rather than them running separately? It becomes a trader. That means take all the volume, put it to an aggregator, and from there determine how can I optimize it. Because some days the demand is lower here and the higher there, so you then swap it and then you get much more optimization. So the gas aggregator was nothing more than just the trader, internal trader, to optimize, get a bit more, to make a little bit more money in between. So Petros were created not to take over the role of Petronas. So the narrative among most Malaysians today is that, Petros is created to eventually take over the role of Petronas. The Premier of Sarawak made it abundantly clear in the interview in Keluar Sekejap. That is not what they're trying to do. What they are trying to do is to take over the role of the aggregator, the internal trader. So which means Petronas will continue its role today in the upstream as the custodian of oil and gas upstream. No change. It is also continue its role as a regulator for oil and gas upstream. No change. It also is the gifter of production sharing contracts in the upstream. No change. Not only is that, it is also an upstream player. Also no change. None of that change. So the only thing that Petros is doing is take the role of the trader or the aggregator for the optimization. So to my mind, there is no way this is going to kill the golden goose that laid the golden egg. So the narrative that the creation of Petros is going to kill the golden goose that lays the golden egg. So that's completely fallacious.
Okay, on that, do you think that this is an issue? So you mentioned narrative. Is it an issue of the language around the deal and the agreement?
It's two things. One is a language. It's an issue around a communication issue. The other one is a confusion about the two issues that I talked about. Because remember, I said there were two. One was the role of Petronas, and the other one, the royalty. So if you confuse the two, then you have a problem. Now, Let me return to the 20% royalty, which is a separate point, quite separate from the gas aggregator role. It is true, a certain oil price, if the oil price drops to a very low level, if Sarawak and Sabah insist on getting 20% of revenue from oil and gas at a very low oil price, actually, Petronas can get into bankruptcy state. They can run out. Okay, that's true. And so that is why the problem arises if oil price gets to a low level. And it depends on the cost of Petronas. So at low oil price, if Petronas cost is very high, then it will not survive at the low oil price. I think there's an answer to this. I want to get straight to the solution. For me, it's very simple. There must be a mechanism that is created to make sure that Petronas does not die. Petronas will continue to operate. It will not be able to get into a point where it will become cash-strapped and eventually it will lead to its demise. And the solution to me is quite simple. They should create a council that's chaired by the Prime Minister. PMX should chair this council. And in this council should be the Premier of Sarawak and the Chief Minister of Sabah. They are there together with their key advisors in that group. And it also has Petronas. Petronas is inside this. What do? Once a year, Petronas should submit their full OPEX requirement, that operating expenditure for the year next year. This is what we need to run operation. And they will say, this is what I need to do for capital investment, for CapEx. So they will say, I need this for operating expenditure, this is for investment. That's what I need. And of course, both Sabah and Sarawak will examine the details, whether they have padded it, what is really necessary and unnecessary. That is a period for them to look at it fairly, and that's quite common. So once that is done, then you agree the numbers there. That is then called the Petronas threshold. In my view, that is what is needed to be given to Petronas to make sure it has the money enough to operate and money enough to invest for expansion. From on top of that, after you put that aside, that's a starting point. You take that aside and make sure Petronas has got that from the profit that is made. Then the question arises, is there still enough money to give to Sabah and Sarawak to honor the 20% oil royalty? So at a very high oil price, surely there's enough money to do it. At a low oil price, then it's less. It could be they only get 10% at a very low oil price, and a high oil price, they get the maximum 20%. It depends.
So the cut is dynamic and it's dependent on oil price
yeah.
as well as a well and clearly defined threshold for Petronas.
Yeah, and so if you do that, that's an annual exercise. Every year, this is justified. By the way, this is not new. Huh? In the downstream oil and gas, there's what is called an automatic price mechanism. That's exactly what all the oil companies like Shell, when I was in Shell, we submit to Petronas. What is the cost that is needed through the government as well. And that's what's called allowed cost to recover. That's how the price.
So if there are existing mechanisms like this, the question is, why is this dispute ongoing?
I don't know. I mean, frankly speaking, I'm not in the government, so I don't know. No. Frankly speaking, to me, the answer is quite simple and it's very clear. If you do that, that's fair and square. Nobody in Sabah and Sarawak would want Petronas to die. And I know that for certain because I've spoken to some of the leaders there in conversation I have. Of course, everybody in Sabah and Sarawak want the federation to thrive. Nobody in Sabah and Sarawak want the federation to collapse. We're part of the federation. We all want the federation, the whole of Malaysia, to succeed. That is why they are not arguing for 100% of the oil revenue belonging to them because they want to be part of the federation. So I think that's not an issue. You have to find a mechanism that's fair and square. So I think the starting point must be you take the money that is to fulfill the Petronas threshold, and Petronas will be able to continue its operation. It will continue to expand overseas and do business based on the investment required. So I think that's one. So I think if you solve that question, then the next question arising in the role of Petros. The role of Petros is limited only to the aggregator. I call it the internal trader, the layman term. There's no way taking over the role of Petronas in its gifter of the PSC production sharing contract. the regulator for oil and gas. Nothing to do with that. Let me be very clear today, Leon. I mean, I want people out there to listen to this. Very simple idea. We have a very novel production sharing contract regime in Malaysia. It works like this. Let's say Shell has found oil and gas in the ground under its contracted production sharing contract for 20 years. When it operates the field and makes a profit out from it, I'm deducting all the allowed costs, then you arrive at a profit. Most people in Malaysia don't know this. Shell only get 5% of the profit it had made. 5% of the profit that Shell had made from that business goes to Shell. Another 5% goes to the state of Sarawak. Only 5%. The remaining 90% for all the work that Shell had put in to get the oil, explore it, to produce it, and do everything that's required to take it from the ground, 90% of that goes to Petronas on behalf of the federal government. So already you can see today, all that the Sarawak government is saying, wow, that 90% going to federal government, this especially coming from our territory in Sarawak. So that's why they say, why don't we increase the 5% to make it 20%? Let me return back to the federal government argument. I was Minister of Federal Government. It is true, if you take 20% out from the federal coffer, you will reduce the money for federal government, for sure. And that means not enough money to be given to Kedah, to Perlis, to Kelantan and others. That's for sure, that's without doubt. But you know, Leon, I have been long enough to have a look at Malaysia in what is called by the World Bank, the measure is called tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. Tax revenue as a percentage.
So what's our
of
figure?
GDP. Our figure has, when I was in government, stood at around 12. I think today, I was just looking at the data, it appears we moved to 13% of GDP. That is, say 12 to 13% of GDP. That's very low actually, relatively speaking. In Africa, these are very poor countries, Leon. The continent of Africa, their tax revenue as percentage of GDP stands at 16%. Asia Pacific stands at 19%. OECD country is around 34%. Now, if the government and the PMX have the conviction and courage to make a real impact in terms of transforming this country, obviously they need money to do it. We want to make sure we have some of the best education system, the best public health system, the best public transport system that exists there, and everything else is really up to par. All that we do is that we increase our tax, not equal to Asia Pacific. Just bring in GST, bring it up to the level of Africa. Africa is a much poorer country relative to us, yet the people paying more tax relative to Malaysians actually. There's 16%. I did a calculation earlier on before we did this podcast, Leon. My calculation suggests if we just do that, Malaysia's additional tax for the Malaysian government would stand at ringgit Malaysia 78 billion ringgit per year. That is more than 33% of our total government revenue. Now, if you were to lose 20% of the oil royalty, this is the oil royalty, which is 40% of government revenue. If we just increase our tax revenue through GST and other things, we will already be able to increase our revenue for the country to 33%, 78%, 78 billion ringgit per year. Frankly speaking, Leon, if you ask me today, we are blessed in this country. We have the ammunition sitting there, but we haven't pulled it yet. The opportunity is there. Other countries, they have already done it, and they don't have the opportunity. We have the opportunity.
And we had done it before.
We done it before.
Under your time.
My time we introduced that. I argued vehemently when I was a minister that we must introduce GST.
While we're talking about that, can you maybe outline why GST as opposed to the SST that was put in place to replace GST?
Yeah. Well, two things. The whole world believes that GST, without doubt, hands down, it's much more effective tax system compared to the sales services tax because of the multi-level tax system and multiple rebate. So that means if a factory produce a product and it sells to the wholesaler, there is a rebate, but they must claim it. The wholesaler can claim it by putting the real data. And from the wholesaler, when he sells the product to a retailer and to the consumer, the retailer will have to make claims to the government for it. When he claims it, the data that flows all the way from the manufacturer to the wholesaler to the retailer and back to the consumer must line up.
Yeah.
You can't cheat because the data will show it. Today, the SST is a tax that happens only at the consumer end. It doesn't do the multi-stage. And therefore, a lot of people cheat. And they put fake numbers, etc. And they found a way to dodge the system. That is why today, a lot of opportunities for people to make all sorts of ways and means to evade paying the right amount of taxes to the government. So that's why 134 countries in the world have embraced GST or VAT in other countries, they call it, because it's a much fairer system. And secondly, what it means, in Malaysia, only we have over 32 million people living in this country. The people who pay income taxes is only 1.5 million people. And so the beauty of both SST and GST is that this is a consumption tax. It's not an income tax. That means the more you buy, the more you consume, the more you pay tax. So it means everybody who buys will have to pay tax. So because everybody who buys will pay tax, that means the base is very big. So you don't have to impose such a high rate for it because the base is already very big. That's why it's a much fairer system. As I said before, under the SST regime, there's a tremendous opportunity for people to cheat in the system because they then create fake numbers. But under the GST system, it's very difficult for you to do it because you have to claim the rebate. And so the real numbers, if you cheat it, the subsequent number from the manufacturer to the wholesaler in the chain, you will be found out. And that's why it is a much fairer system. To my mind, the beauty for Malaysia is this. We are blessed because we have the opportunity to increase our tax revenue as percentage of GDP to just be as good as Africa, not even as good as Asia Pacific, not as good as, if you like, the OECD countries. And we have so much revenue. And we can do so many things. We don't have to worry about Petros. We don't have to worry about the 20% royalty. To my mind, 40% of government revenue relying on Petronas is not the way to go. We are overly dependent on Petronas generating 40% of the revenue. We have to move away from that so that the revenue must spread out into other forms. That's why I really argue that this country absolutely need to introduce a GST. And in particular, because of the issues that has to do with all the transformation that's needed, we have to fix our education system, public health. Our public transport needs real improvement. And there are many things we need to do here. But the beauty today is that we have an opportunity. And if we did this, it will solve all the problems. So,
and we have the evidence as well, because it was something that you had.
We did it before.
We had in place.
Yeah, we
and
did
so we
it
have
before.
obviously seen the fruit of it.
Absolutely.
So we have a historical reference to draw from if we were to reintroduce GST to see how this lever can ultimately be very equitable for the country. And I think I like what you said earlier about not being overly reliant on the golden goose, as it were. Because actually you can even make an argument that if we're not so hung up on the percentage, that if this proper collaboration between Petronas and Petros takes place, where Petros is fully optimizing as the aggregator, then while you might reduce the overall percentage for Petronas, you could make an argument that if you are more optimized if you have an aggregator who is optimizing for you, then you're ultimately able to generate more revenue anyway.
Yeah.
Which will then offset the reduced percentage, if you like, which will be less of a concern in terms of its effect on the national coffers. But in any case, that's further padded up by the fact that you have other levers to pull for national revenue. So, I mean, that begs the question then, what do you think are the challenges politically?
The challenge politically is this. On the one hand, the government today that you have here is a coalition government, a unity government that's very fragile. Very fragile. And it depends very much on the coalition staying intact. The question today is that the federal government requires for the current government to stay in power, it requires the votes from both Sabah and Sarawak to stay within the coalition. And so PMX has to make sure that they stay within the tent. They don't go astray. Because if they go astray, I mean, the government can collapse today. They form a new coalition. You can see what has happened there. And I think nobody wants that. People want a steady and stable government, wait for proper election, don't go and change the government halfway. That's a terrible thing to do. So there is that equation about it being a fragile government. And so walking on a tightrope like this is a very difficult thing. And when you're fragile, you're very worried about your own shadows. Little things that you might worry about, if you did this, maybe this is the problem, that would be the problem. So there's not enough courage to take on challenging and difficult things. For example, like increasing the tax, introducing GST. When you're fragile government, you really worry about losing elections because it's fragile, people move. And the other thing that's needed is this. It's also, from the standpoint of Sabah and Sarawak, both of them know that they have the whole trump card. That's called the petroleum sales tax. Both Sabah and Sarawak are at liberty to increase the percentage of the petroleum sales tax, which is now pegged at 5%. They can increase even more. So if the federal government doesn't concur with them on the 20% oil royalty, all they need to do is increase the petroleum sales tax and checkmate. So I think they know that they hold the trump card. They can say, well, if you don't give me the 20%, I just keep on increasing the sales tax. Now it's 5%. I make it 10%, I make it 15%. I can do that. But they are not doing it because they are now talking about a discussion that took place between federal government and the state government. And they have agreed this before. This is not a new thing. They have agreed it. It's public knowledge. Everybody agreed. But the modalities, people are dragging their feet to it. That's why we must deal with where the fear is. I made a suggestion, and this is again, I repeat it, create a council chaired by the Prime Minister. Both Sabah and Sarawak are represented there with the Chief Ministers and Petronas. When they annually submit the requirement for CapEx and OpEx, that is the amount of money that's required in the first instance to be given to Petronas for the subsequent year. So that Petronas will have its money to operate profitably, will have its money to then expand, invest profitably. So that's no issue. And if oil price is high, then you get 20%. If oil price is low, it can be less than 20, it could be 15, could be 16. But it's very important that we honor that. Honor the Petronas threshold amount. So I think this is fair. I don't think anybody, if you logically put this across to Sabah and Sarawak, I don't think they would disagree with this. Frankly speaking, I don't think they would disagree. I mean, I hope everybody listens to what I'm saying here. I honestly believe it can be done because we already have a mechanism of that nature for the downstream. It's called the automatic price mechanism. It already exists. And so because it already exists, we know that all the oil companies annually submit their costs that's required to run the downstream operation. That is then part of the automatic price mechanism. So I have no reason to doubt that it cannot work. And the other one, as I said before, is just a simple thing. Petronas is not going to die. Petros is not taking over the role. I've already categorically said Petros is only taking the part called the aggregator. The gifter of PSC, everything in the upstream remains unchanged. By the way, all the contracts, the signed contract within the buyer and the seller, the producer, should be no change. So everything is no change. This guy in the middle called the trader, the aggregator, is the optimizer, if you like. That's the only role that's changed. Bearing in mind, Leon, up to the year 2005, that role did not exist. It didn't exist. And the whole time I was in MLNG on the board, I knew for a fact it didn't exist because there were contracts that were between the buyer and the seller, and the production PSE operator, and then the buyer, in this case, Shell MDS. And MLNG 1, MLNG 2, MLNG 3, they have all their PSE operator that provided the volumes, 20-year volumes are agreed, the schedule for deliveries, and the price. Those things remain unchanged. So to my mind, people must come down and relax. They come down and relax. They said, actually, we make it quite clear, put it crystal clear that the role of Petros does not extend beyond what we've just described. And if you do it like this, for the life of me, I don't understand why this thing continue on and on and on without being resolved.
Yeah. Well, perhaps there's a perception issue. Perhaps there's also maybe reasons why maybe certain parts of the agreement need to be laid out more explicitly as well. But I think ultimately all of these things will be possible, if we do as you described, of essentially getting your golden goose, getting the golden goose's farmers in the room, as well as the farmers' neighbors. But while doing that, also figuring out then on the farmer's part, how we can not just rely on the one golden goose, but think of how we can have other geese, maybe other animals as well. Different species in the farm, so that you're not overly reliant on the golden goose, which will make those conversations on a yearly basis, or whatever the cadence is, a lot more pleasurable and equitable for everybody. I think this is a great place to land today's podcast, a slightly more tactical one. Thank you all for listening to yet another episode of The Game of Impossible. We hope you enjoyed this conversation today. If you did, we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube as well as Spotify. We upload episodes every Friday at 6 a.m. We also have short form content on both our IG as well as TikTok at The Game of Impossible. Thank you all for listening once again, and we'll see you guys next week.